it's going to be very clear very shortly that there are going to be a lot of industries that are going to die. I mean, take tourism for instance. I'm not sure how the airline industry can dream of being carbon neutral within 10 years. I mean, it just defies imagination. I don't know whether they've got Superman there at their helm, but this has huge implications for our city of Melbourne. The retail industry, I mean, that's our industry of which produces mass consumption, which produces all of ultimately the pollutants, the resource depletion, and this has, I mean, Myers, for instance, we're overshot. I mean, surely there are going to be some sort of businesses where you'll be saying, you don't really have a future in your current form. How are we going to tackle these sorts of things, Sally? And there are going to be emerging industries as well, which you'll need to stimulate. So there's going to be a bit of carrot and stick, and you have to probably look at this with open eyes and saying these are the directions, and we can be quite specific. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think. Thank you. Just we're passing the whole stand. How about that? The talking stick. The talking stick. We love talking sticks. Look, I agree, and a big part of our strategies, for example, the founding platform of our waste and resource recovery strategy is to actually reduce the amount of waste in the first place. Not just how we deal with it, which is important, but what can we do, what role can we play in our community to reduce the amount of waste, and that a lot of that comes to consumerism. But I think we are seeing change, and I'm picking up on some of the themes from earlier, is that, and maybe it's a bit of me, I'm a glass all the way full sort of person, but even with Fashion Week, for example, as an event that we've run for decades now, and the whole theme of Fashion Week is runway to retail. So actually encouraging people to buy things to support our local businesses. And yet so much of the feedback over the last couple of years from the participants, from our audiences, has pushed us more to slow fashion, to fashion that's made from quality materials, recycled materials, fashion that lasts a long time. It's actually about slowing down that cycle. In fact, this year, which has never been done before in Australia, we had fashion runways where we didn't require a new range. It was quite fine for our designers to show ranges that they've produced previously or do retrospectives, etc. And that occurrence, just as one key indicator, is really being driven by what our audiences are telling us, what those designers are telling us they want. And so I think the more we can really push on the demand side, it is carrot and stick, I get that, but the more we can make people excited and enthused about new opportunities that have previously been seen as challenges and threats, the quicker we're going to be able to respond to this.
I agree entirely, Sally. In fact, this rather handsome jacket I picked up for a song at Camberwell Market, and I'm very happy to model it. Take away the face, but...
and we didn't talk beforehand, so
no,
that wasn't a direct
I understand that. But there are some industries which are going to present huge challenges, and one of them, Will, I think you'll agree, is growing food, because that is going to... that accounts for many of the environmental problems that we have. And if you take cities like Havana and Cuba, for instance, they had a huge challenge when they had to encounter their special period, and they had to learn how to grow food. And they had to grow food with almost no food miles. And so growing food within the city is going to be another one, and protecting areas like the Werribee River system, which could be threatened by PS, what are those wastes that are coming out of the Westgate Tunnel? All of those sorts of things are obviously going to be hugely important. Okay, now moving on a little bit, we are going to have to look at levers for change. It's one thing to say this is what we want to do, it's how to do it, and which is exactly what Robyn was talking about, and some of the levers we're going to have to think about how we're going to apply them. And this applies not just at the local level, it applies at all levels. And so perhaps, Adam, it's your turn to have a think about that, because too often Governments think about legislation and say that's it, and they walk away from it hoping it'll happen, but it never does, because it's all in the detail and managing the change process, which is something that governments are notoriously bad at.
Sorry, pass the stick.
I think there's some pretty clear examples now in Australia and around the world of transition done well and transition done badly. And I think we've got, I think we have seen that it can be done well. And I mean, Germany is an example of a place that basically got out of coal without force or mass redundancies. I mean, for different reasons, partly it was climate, it was primarily safety, but they basically phased out underground coal mining, and did it in a way that was done in cooperation between the unions and the employers, and with the government backing a proper transition plan. And at the start, some of the vested interests or the relevant interests said, no, we don't want this, we oppose it, but the government came in and said, no, we've got to do it, you got time to do it, and they worked together and they did it. I think in Australia that's the point that we're at, and I think legislation is going to be absolutely critical, but there needs to be a plan, and there needs to be a plan that everyone understands. And so one of the biggest things that we've got to do is get out of, our energy system is still incredibly reliant on coal-fired power stations, and it's fantastic to see that renewables are now cheaper as a new build, but we've still got a lot of coal in the system, and the government talks about a gas-led recovery to get out of COVID. And they say, oh, well, gas is cleaner than coal. A, it's not, but B, they're talking about gas and coal, not gas instead of coal. We've still got all those coal-fired power stations chugging away. The question is, what does a transition plan look like that has legislated targets for coal-fired power station closure, but that also provides the support for industries and communities to make the transition? And that's where I think we can do that, but we've also got to be clear-eyed about what it will take to grow new industries in those places. And as I said before, some of those will be in energy, and we're actually really well placed in places like the Hunter, but also in Queensland, to actually make a kind of a switch to make those the places that will have green hydrogen and green steel. Newcastle, for example, we've really got some massive opportunities there if we start investing in those. But it might also be that government need to go in with a plan that's not about getting people to work in another mine, or it might be saying, well, we're going to phase out coal, but we'll find you a job on a different kind of mine, because we're going to still need mining. Or it might be that we're going to strengthen the transmission lines from Queensland to New South Wales to grow a 100% renewable energy system. Anyone who worked in a coal mine before is now guaranteed first dibs at a job in strengthening the transmission lines, for example. That kind of planning and thinking is not being done at the moment, and it can't be directed by government, but it can be enabled by government, and government must put in place that framework and must put in place the resources. Otherwise, you have potential shocks that are bad for people and bad for communities, but they can be exploited politically as well to slow down the transition. And I think Trump is a classic example of how you can use that dislocation that comes when you have transitions done badly and use it for malevolent ends.
Thank you, Adam. Now, Professor Johan Rockström has likened the challenge to landing a man on Mars. It's huge, and we don't have much time. And the suggestion, I don't think it's a suggestion, I think it's a statement that this is one of the requirements, is that it's going to have to be run like that program. In other words, it's going to have to be project managed on a global scale so that we achieve these targets. And there are going to be all sorts of skills that are going to have to be required and introduced at every level to make sure these are achieved, because if there are any weak links, it all falls apart. So, looking at the sort of things that you're doing, Sally, I'm going to ask the same thing of Adam. If we're going to have to meet these targets by almost yesterday, that means we have to really start doing now things that have to be done, and we have to measure them in terms of their impact. So, I mean, I've been a project manager for donkey's years, and I know that I have to do certain things and meet certain objectives, and that's the way I work. but it's not a common mentality amongst people in government. So maybe that's a challenge for you.
Well, it can be, and even in the private sector, the saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. So if you start measuring things, all the resources and effort goes to that, because we're all goal-oriented, aren't we?
Yes, they are.
And one of the reasons why we're moving to... We've got measurements that are not just clear and understood by us, but are well understood and being delivered in other places around the world, and that's important because there's clarity, there's certainty in what those measurements are, and we've had some doozies at Town Hall about what we're measuring. Hard for anybody to understand what the measurement is, and therefore, of course, it impacts the results. It's also important for us because when you take on benchmarks and measurements that are used by other organisations, cities, nations, etc., then there's a lot of learning and sharing that can happen, and that's been a really big driver for us. We've done a lot of that through the C40 organisation and many other alliances, but now coming into the SDG world, we can see the great thing about the SDGs is how interdependent the goals are on each other. So it really makes, we've just done some mapping across our operations to show that the decision made over here, you know, the classic silos, and the direct impact it can have on goals over here. So we're getting that alignment. But for us, it means that we can more easily identify cities that are doing some of these things better than us and go directly to them for learning and sharing. And the same goes with our efforts, and we're taking this on as a responsibility to work with other cities that are well behind us on certain elements and work with them to bring them up. And so for us, that sense of measurement, moving to measurements that are well understood, that are transparent and are shared, is going to be, I think, one of the big bold steps that will help drive and accelerate our progress on many of these initiatives.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ali. Now, I would have thought that there's a role for the scientists here, because it's all very well for a government agency to say, well, these are the standards, but really, perhaps the ultimate auditor on this are probably the scientists. Would you agree?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no. I think that
scientists can provide some quantitative evaluation of performance against defined measures or metrics. But I also like to say that actually climate change isn't a science problem anymore. Climate change is a people problem. And the critically important issue is not to expect scientists to give you the answers. They can tell you background information, but actually, unless we get the sorts of social changes, governance changes and social engagement, we are going to end up in a very difficult place. And in fact, the federal government examples of the good solutions that have been lost because of bad communication or bad social understanding is a very clear demonstration that the failures of, if you like, behavioural change and social change, and equally social understanding of the issues that Adam's talked about, Sally, you've talked about, and you're very much aware that what you both are trying to do in your spheres is critically dependent upon getting the people to understand. So I would like to go back to, I actually think the most important things are improving the public education and communication systems and making sure that people want to do these things, because they won't vote for it if they don't want to do it. We've got to demonstrate the benefits. So I'm going to come back to you and say, actually, science is not important unless psychology is a science, and it is. But what is critically important is behavioural engagement and social engagement to get people to want to do what we've been talking about. I would argue that that's a massive response through both advertising and education. But for market solutions, I would say the best way is to just ban advertising. But that's not going to get me elected on anything.
All right. Well, look, I think we're at the stage now we've got lots of good ideas, and what I'm going to invite you three members of the panel, that's David, Will and Robyn, to suggest possible ways in which Sally and Adam's wonderful plans, great as they are, could even be improved further. What sort of things, Robyn, do you think you could see or would suggest that could be included? Now, we're going to call this a manifesto because we might need a manifesto to start with.
I'd just like to share a story from my experience as a visiting professor in Sweden last year before COVID. I was at Lund University for 6 months, and the researchers there are incredibly inventive. They've developed a climate imaginaries project where they designed a museum exhibit pretending it was 2050, including a range of objects that are familiar to us now that have become obsolete then. And they got me involved in the meat and dairy workshop because I grew up on a farm, which was interesting. And then the exhibition had the objects and a narrative as to how we got from here to there, both in terms of social change, political and legislative change. So we had to figure out the politics and a kind of plausible scenario, and we all developed it. Then they got a fiction writer to write it up. So every object had a story, and when the exhibit happened, there were students located next to every object with the story, or the public could read it. At the launch, they had someone come in with a leaf blower and earmuffs to quieten everyone for the announcement, and that was the first obsolete object. But in the cabinet of curiosities, there was a frequent flyer card. There was a piece of Lego, no more plastic, it's now a collector's item. There was a Big Mac, no. There were a whole lot of things. And there was some things that weren't as freely available, things that freaked me out. Chocolate, ice cream, coffee. But nonetheless, there were...
Wine.
Well, no, there was still wine, fortunately. And beer, home brewing. But some of it was quite comical and engaging, but some of the small sacrifices were nothing compared to the suffering we've saved. And because they were humorous, and it was all totally imaginable, and this new world, a zero-carbon world, was, hey, I can do this. This is not too tricky. They've also been involved in a big reinvent research project looking at all the different sectors, from plastics to steel and so forth, called Reinvent. And again, they're coming up with very practical solutions for the sector. So this kind of visualisation brings it down to the everyday. There's obviously a lot more bicycling, and that, you know, your city of Melbourne is moving nicely in this direction. I love the way you've got biodiversity in there. And I think the other little point I'd like to finish with is that there was a silver lining to COVID because we all walked a lot more. We didn't buy. We had to go back on our own resources. In many cities, the air cleared up, a bit of wildlife returned, and we started to see things and feel things and live things differently. I mean, there was a lot of people that really missed shopping and rushed back when the lockdown began to ease. But a lot of us said, I don't need new stuff. So this remaking community, this idea of being attentive to material and energy flows and doing the biooriginal quiz. Where does everything come from and where does everything go? And let's close it into a closed loop economy. This is stuff you can start at kindergarten, primary school, education and community level. And people have an appetite for it now in a way that we've never seen before. And strangely, COVID has helped to generate that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Can I go next?
Yes, you can, David.
Because, well, get the question. I'm going to follow on directly from Robyn. I don't follow rules very well. There is an exhibition available online and in person at the Museum of Design in Adelaide called The Seven Siblings, which is the same as what you've talked about. Exists already, was started last year around a family of 7 in the sort of 2030 to 2050 period, where each of them has different expertise, different interests. They look at the things that went out of fashion between 2010 or 2020 and 2040, 2050. They have new jobs, they have new careers, they live in the new city. And it looks at how people can visit them now online as well as visit the scenario. It's called Museum of Design and the Seven Siblings exhibition. You can all find it. It is fantastic. It's better to go to face-to-face because you get a transport to Adelaide, but you can also do it online. It's also critically important, as you said, to think about this as combination of social, behavioural, arts and science, because we need to think about how many people, unfortunately for me, don't like numbers, but they will engage with art and performance as a way to help them understand problems. The arts have played massive roles in communication and understanding of problems in the past. We need to make use of that in community education, as well as brochures and booklets. Performance and the arts through museums, galleries, and other things is critically important.
I have 3 questions to close with before we pass on. Robyn has actually anticipated one of them and she's answered it very well. But one for you, Will. Whilst Australia is showing very little leadership on this, some countries have made significant progress, and Adam's referred to Germany in this regard. But perhaps you might elaborate a little bit further. Which countries are leading? What are they doing? What do they need to do? What factors have been... I usually load my questions up like cluster bombs, but anyway, what factors have been critical for their success, and what you see as the greatest challenges, and how must we respond?
Yeah, I'm going to twist that a little bit, because when you actually look at the emission reduction trajectories, there really aren't any countries of any size that are really doing close to what they need to do. Even if you look at Sweden, for example, it still is far too little, far too late in where it's going at the national level. So I want to twist it by building on what a lot of people are saying. The subnational level is where you should really get excited. And this tipping point that I keep talking about is going to come bottom up. It's not going to come from national governments. They're going to be turfed out when people decide they're not doing enough. But I'm lucky in a way in that I've lived in Canberra for 44 years now, and I was on the ACT Climate Change Council in 2011 when we had a social tipping point, and it was due to a student. Her name was Phoebe Howe. And we had a territory election in 2011, and she started a movement called Canberra Loves 40. And it was about a 40% in emission reduction between 2011 and 2020. And of course, it sounded outrageous in 2011 because we didn't have the cheap renewables then, and we didn't know how we were going to do it. But she and her group of students tipped the territory election. That was fairly clear. And the incoming government, which was a Labor government with some support from a couple of Greens members, decided, hey, we better deliver on this. Formed a council, had a very clever guy named Simon Corbell, who was the minister at that time, and decided, given particularly after 2013 with a hostile Commonwealth government, that we are going to start a reverse auction process and boost both the renewable industry and get cheap electricity for Canberra. I remember going and talking to the economists in the department, the economics department, and they were dead set against this. You're going to kill Canberra's economy. This is going to be a disaster for the city. You can't do this. Much to the government's credit, they overrode them and said, we're going to do it. Now, 20 years down the track, we now legislated an emission reduction curve that's the equivalent of about a 1.7 degree trajectory. The economists are on board. Why? Employment's up. Canberra's local economy is booming. Renewable energy companies have moved their headquarters there because it's friendly. And so the point I want to make is a lot of the actions occurring at that level. We've heard about the city of Melbourne. We've heard about many other cities that are moving. And we've heard about states. Every Australian state and territory now is ahead of the Commonwealth government in terms of what it wants to do. South Australia is probably even ahead of the ACT in some ways. So I would say let's worry about governance rather than countries and the level of governance that matters and how we influence that. One more thing about the ACT is that we don't have a first-past-the-post electorate. We have a system where the votes, the membership of the ACT Legislative Assembly represents the proportion of votes that various parties are getting. We now have a three-party system, not a two-party system, because the Greens are now up to 6 members in the last election, up from 2. And the major parties are 10, 9, and 6. And now we have a government that actually represents what people are thinking. At the national level, we have a Liberal national government, but in Canberra, out of 25 seats, they only have 9. The people who want to do something have 16. And I think it's that sort of changes in governance that are going to help us as well. But the final point, there's a lot of really good action on governance, but it's not normally at national levels. And Robyn put a finger on it. That's where the incumbents act to try to keep their power base.
Thank you. And the last question is one for David. And it's really about adaptation, because we're going to have to adapt anyway. And your work in the CSIRO has been focusing on ways to assist business adapt to the changing environment. Can you very briefly, because we've got only a little bit of time, but you do need to say this, perhaps you could tell us a little bit briefly about your ideas on how this could be progressed and expanded, and what more you would like to see from government?
Look, that is a really important question, because most of our conversations so far this afternoon have really been about emission reduction, but it is critically important to recognise that we have a certain amount of ongoing climate change locked into the system, and we have to manage the impacts of climate change that are happening already and are already locked in, and they will continue to impact ecosystems and coastlines and agriculture and cities and coastlines and, most importantly, people. But all of those impacts, the tricky part about climate change adaptation is that the sorts of impacts will be place dependent and time dependent. Unfortunately, the time dependence is they will tend to get worse, not simply just linearly, but some of them will get worse very dramatically and will often be associated with the sorts of extreme events that occurred in the most recent 2019-2020 summer in New South Wales and in eastern Victoria. Fortunately, Melbourne was not as badly impacted by extreme events, except some of the smoke. But we know that in terms of understanding the best ways to adapt to climate change, the first thing to do is to make sure that people understand the ways that their business or community has been affected by recent events in the past. Because one of the best ways to think about, if you like, the stress testing that climate change will impose on different systems is to look at the ways that the systems have been impacted recently. Whether it's Black Saturday in 2009 or other extreme events, and there are many of them that have impacted systems. Businesses are much more aware often than climate scientists about the sorts of impacts. Working between the scientists, the industries or businesses and the companies themselves, they will help us understand better the way to work together to provide solutions. And it's then the co-design of the solutions and taking into account the range of extreme events, in some sense doing crisis. It's not crisis management after the fact, it's doing scenario analysis about the extreme events and how you could manage them before they actually have happened, based on extreme events, and doubling or trebling their intensities, which is a good model for what might happen in the future.
Thank you, David. I think before we open this up to question time from the audience, and we've got live and virtual audiences here, I'll just provide my own little summary of this. I think the dimensions and scale of this challenge and its complexity is starting to become very clear. What we're talking about is total change in our thinking, values, aspirations and the way we live, the economy that drives it. And some of the levers, and we've talked about those, that are required to manage the change process. And this will not be achieved simply by bolting on an emissions reduction program to business as usual. Perhaps what we need is a charter or even a manifesto that outlines the dimensions and scale of our challenge together with our aspirations, values, guidings and principles and a plan for survival. I've been through two of those exercises, one for Transport for Melbourne. I thought we'd knock this off over perhaps not a coffee, but maybe a day. It took several weeks. I did another one for T4E. That took 6 months. It's not that easy. But I think until you've got that, you don't have a reference board in the background which says this is what our values and directions are and this is what we stand for. Because we always seem to be opting out in different ways. We don't have something to come back to. So I think maybe, it's my suggestion, that we do need a manifesto just for human survival, to be honest. We could devote many hours discussing this further, but it needs to be thought through very carefully because it will provide the foundation on which to build, and our future depends on how well this is carried out. It's how well this is carried out that increasingly becomes important. And that will require a very different mindset, one that is outcome focused, not import focused, as is so often the case today. All right, what I'd like to do now is invite questions from the audience. And do we have any? Oh no, I should start. Our President Nick Lowe did ask a question. I asked him to come up with a question, so I'm going to give him the privilege of asking you, Robyn. I think this is who he directed it to. He says, "You asked me if I had any questions to put to the forum. The one that keeps coming to mind, which is perhaps one for Robyn, is this. As evidenced, for instance, in the work of Thomas Piketty, who I'm sure you're well aware of, across the world we are seeing continuing social crises of inequality, stagnant incomes in the middle socio-economic tiers, unemployment or employment insecurity, and poverty in the lower tiers, and burgeoning wealth of the top 1%. In short, a return to an earlier phase of capitalism." Now, I think, Adam, you referred to some of these issues earlier as well. This trajectory of inequality looks like being exacerbated by COVID. My question then is, how does this social trajectory of liberal democracy play into the environmental crisis? That's a big cluster bomb, isn't it?
As I mentioned in my presentation, there are some big structural changes happening. And the move from Fordist to post-Fordist production has had profound effects on the union movement and class structure. And the shift towards platform capitalism, with big Google, Facebook and so forth, and also the gig economy, have led to a growing precariat. And these are major problems, and there's a big challenge, which I know Adam has been thinking about deep and hard for a long time, the future of work. And so like Adam's metaphor, you don't just do one thing, but you do many things with the one move. We have to go into the climate crisis and the ecological crisis more generally by thinking about inequality, because inequality breaks down social trust, and that's really bad for democracy. And that's part of the problem we have with growing polarisation around the world and the rise of nationalist populism, which is partly identity-based, but also they're in the old economy, and they want that back, and Trump promised that. So Trump's fallen, but his base is still there. If I were advising Joe Biden, I'd go straight into those regions of America and think of ways of local economic regeneration. Don't boast, don't even say anything. Do it quietly and get it done. And get that opioid epidemic out of the way. That's serious there, but that's why I think we do need a more progressive taxation system, because we need a green welfare state to steer forward and meet this crisis. But I totally agree with Will, and I really do congratulate you, Sally, for what you're doing in the city of Melbourne. This bottom-up surge is the way to do it, and nation-states are the last place to learn. But we haven't really talked about international relations and foreign policy. I'll just finish on this. I'm slipping it in because I may not get another chance. Our renewable energy future will change geopolitics. America's grand strategy was built around many things, but one of them was access to oil in the Middle East. Its biggest military in the world was to police the shipping lanes to get that oil to America. That's all going to go. Energy independence around the world is going to produce a safer world. And Ross Garnaut has been talking about it. Australia as an energy superpower, exporting hydrogen elsewhere, which is a good thing. But we don't want to undermine the energy independence of other countries and put them in a step-over toehold. That's not bad for politics. It needs to be an equitable... We need to think about their energy independence too. We can do that. But maybe not on the scale he's suggesting if we really do want energy independence for everyone, particularly developing countries.
Thank you very much, Rob. Now I'm going to have to say cheerio to Adam, and thank you very, very much for participating in this. We've really appreciated it. He has a meeting, and I'm really grateful. And
congratulations on such a successful forum.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, do we have any more questions? Yes. Lucy, I think. Thank you.
So I guess speaking as someone who's just graduated Year 12, going in, wanting to go into politics, And as a representative of the Student Voice Network, so a youth platform for students from across Australia to come together and take collective action on the issues that are important to them, climate change being a really big one of them, as I've spoken to you about, stealing up all of your rest break time. But what I would love to know is what you would suggest in terms of youth power to really advocate in a meaningful way for climate action. We've seen it with the School Strike for Climate movement, Greta, and many other forms, but in terms of national change and some national change, what should we be putting our effort into?
Wow, that's a great question, and I might do some more thinking about that. Actually, I can tell you though that the strikes, the protests. I can't say strike, can I? It's a protest. The filling our city with young people. And doing that in a very peaceful, respectful, but very strident way, shutting down the city. Those sorts of things really have changed the conversation, because it's really helped us change the debates from the impact now of some of the policies to really thinking about the impact in the future. And it's that guardianship of the leaders now to make sure that there's something for you to lead in the future. Even saying that feels patronising, because you're already showing leadership, and so I would encourage you to keep doing that. The most influential ways, I think, are, and again, I'm speaking of this, but I'm actually going to do some more thinking about it, is obviously the more combined, I don't want to just say louder, but the more thoughtful. It's like anything where you're looking for change. You actually have to, you can keep beating your head against a wall, and I do plenty of that on lots of issues, but the other way is to put it in the context of those that you're dealing with, understand how to not fit in with those, but push against those existing, and in doing that, you're actually taking you're becoming involved on the inside and moving out, rather than just standing on the outside trying to push in. It was actually a big thing for me as a student around women's issues as well, and women's issues in the workplace. A lot of that change comes from getting inside and then pushing and leading out. So I think one of the big challenges for us at the City of Melbourne, now that you've put it to me, Lucy, is how do we have you more involved on our policy setting internally? We have quite a young workforce, but not as young as you. We do have many committees, and I'm actually thinking that maybe we need to be setting that up, particularly as we move into sustainable development goals, given they have such a longevity to them, and look for ways to have your voices on the insides of our organisations rather than brilliantly speaking from the outside, but that, I think that will help create more change.
Roger, can I just add on to what Zoe's alluded, because there are some organisations that are really well set up, and I know you're already a member of AYCC, but there's an organisation called the United Nations Association for Australia, which actually has a youth agenda as well, a youth membership, UN Youth, which again has national and international fora that allow you to connect with issues at the international level as well. And so obviously you're familiar with, yeah. So you're aware of all the sorts of groups that I'm aware of, and they're already, not just to think about national issues, but to get involved at the international networks as well, because that's critically important.
Yeah, we'll see 40. There's one more organisation, and it's called Global Voices, and they take delegations of students to international negotiations and venues, including the climate negotiations. And I've helped a lot of the students at those delegations. They have a research project they have to work on and follow a line in the negotiation, so they get a real hands-on observation understanding of how the negotiations actually work. So just look that up if you want to have a nice trip abroad to Glasgow next year. Oh. Yeah.
There aren't many places that are better, are there? Now, Jerry, you've got a question.
I'm just interested in posing a question. It seems to me that there's different tensions happening through the COVID-19 experience. We've seen the emergence of participation by ordinary people to a global phenomena that we all need to participate. We've seen this level of cooperation. We've seen it a number of times with major emergency events, say as the Longford gas explosion, for instance, the water crisis, where people participate. It seems to me that people do cooperate and participate. They come to the party in times of crisis. However, when the crisis abates, we see the emergence of state power and people retreat. Now, what I see at the moment with the collapse of COAG and the emergence of the national body, the collapse of the intention to collapse the EPBC Act at the federal level and collapse it to the state level, that we see this sort of collapsing and concentration of power, which funnels to projects and programs that are counter decarbonisation programs. Now, this is happening surreptitiously. So on the one hand, we've got this emergence of community participation and willingness to cooperate and face the challenges of our future, whereas we have this governmental top-down centralisation of power phenomena happening at the same time. How do we deal with this? This is probably a question for politicians and Robyn probably. Scientists may have some view on this, but we all have a view. We all should have a view. It's all our problem.
Great question. In Political Science 101, we teach about collective action problems, and a standard starting point, which has some problems in it, tells us that when there's a collective problem and there's a need for legislative action to deal with it, you have the biggest organisation by the concentrated losers, and the diffuse beneficiaries of the public, which benefit, are usually less organised. And as a result, the concentrated losers, typically a particular industry group or a sector, will do the hardest lobbying, and they'll either dilute the initiative or even possibly prevent it. So that is basic Political Science 101. However, it's when members of the public, the broad diffuse beneficiaries, not the concentrated looters, get together and mobilise, then they provide a counterweight, and that's how it can be fought off. Because the assumption behind that, it's called public choice theory, that everyone's a rational actor and they will maximise their own benefit and free ride on the contribution to collective problems by others. Fortunately, not everyone's that kind of person. Many are, but thank goodness many aren't, and they put a huge amount of work into public service and fighting for the public and indeed global good. And if they weren't out there, we'd be ruined. So all I can say in response to that is for people like you and others to get together and mobilise and fight for those public interests, because that's the nature of politics. You've always got material interests, vested interests at work.
You'd like to add a comment?
Absolutely, because I know a lot of what's happening with the EPBC Act review, and in particular, the legislation that is in Parliament at present has been stopped by the Senate inquiry, and that the bencher group in the Senate will not allow the legislation to progress until after the final report from the EPBC Act review is not only finalised, it's been sitting in the federal government inbox for 3 weeks. Within 15 sitting days, they actually have to make it public. Now, there haven't been 15 sitting days yet. It has the requirements for the environmental standards that are essential for the general public to have confidence that the EPBC Act, if it exists when modified, will require these sorts of standards, both cumulative standards and individual standards, that will ensure the protection and improvement of the EPBC Act. I have seen drafts of the new standards. They are not released yet. I'm not allowed to release them to you, but it's not as bad as it looks at this stage. Have you seen the new standards? Well, you're right. They're feeble at present, but the standards requirement is one of the recommendations of the final report from Samuel, and they are being strengthened.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, Rihanna is a student at Carey, by the way. I'm not sure what year you're in.
I've just finished year 12.
Oh.
Yeah. So I've realised with a whole bunch of my friends and just generally with my year level that the way to solve problems is if people actually feel like they affect them directly. So like racism, homophobia, a lot of people don't actually take them seriously because they don't affect them directly. And much like with COVID, people have actually been acting on it because it feels like it's affecting people directly. So how do we do that with climate change, and how do we make this feel a lot real, or like a lot more real to people who are refusing to listen to us anymore?
Already starting to happen in certain segments of society. One of the things, obviously, that happened within the last 12 months with the massive bushfires along the East Coast, that did change a lot of people. Certainly, although we didn't get hit directly in Canberra, we nearly did. A lot more people who weren't interested in climate change were coming up to me and lots of others saying, does climate change have anything to do with this? I said, yes, it absolutely does, and so on. When you start looking around sectors in society, obviously the firefighters were one that really, a lot of them flipped. Just talked to Greg Mullins, for example. But farmers are changing too, particularly younger farmers, because in the longer term they're seeing the changes in rainfall that David talked about, particularly in the agricultural zones in the southeast and southwest of the country. So I think there is now starting to be enough lived experience of various aspects of climate change, particularly only in the last, I would say, 5 years, that I think we're starting to see a shift at the grassroots level and much more support for action on climate change.
I think the other way to get people to understand is to ask them what they value. In addition to family, what sorts of things do they value? And there was an absolutely fantastic comedy show put on by Rod Quantock, which identified some of the most important thing to young adults, but they're probably older adults now, which was the sort of 20 to 30-year-old age group, the yuppies. And he identified that there were a number of things that were critically important. He described his show as the end of the Tim Tam. No, and what he did was identify that Tim Tams, chocolate, coffee, and red wine were all going to be seriously adversely affected by climate change, and there would have to be a lifestyle that had no chocolate, no coffee, no Tim Tams, and no red wine. And for a large fraction of Melbourne's population, particularly in Fitzroy, they were going to be wiped out because that's 90% of their diet.
Do we have any more questions? Well, if we don't,
can I just follow on to that line and first of all congratulate you, Roger, on hosting this particular seminar and bringing such provocative speakers to the light, to the fore. I hope you've got a very large online audience to capture some of this. But the thought that was going through my mind is that I guess we're all becoming increasingly aware of the climate emergency, but so often we hear that it's a global problem, and we're here just on the margin. We don't really need to worry too much about it ourselves, and that's, I guess, the syndrome that we've got to resolve. And we've heard some great ideas about that. So I guess I'd just like to ask the speakers, based upon our success in handling the COVID across Australia and in Melbourne and Victoria, have we learned some lessons around behavioural change that we can apply to the climate emergency? So to any or all of the speakers, please.
It's a similar theme. Sorry, Robyn. and that is making these big challenges relevant to people and their lives and what it's going to mean for them, to your point. And we all, you know, I think it's don't waste a crisis, is that the saying?
Never
never,
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. I like Homer Simpson because he's a great oracle of our times who says crisis-tunity. And it's a crisis-tunity because it's that flip of what does it mean for individuals and how do we create the carrot part, the opportunity, how do we overcome that sense of threat and turn it into something that is appealing. And to go back to the SDG comments, and I should have said this at the time, one of the reasons that we're excited about moving to that is because so much of the SDGs is relatable. It's actually something people can see and understand, see the negative impact on them, see the positive impact for the future, and that helps us with that storytelling and that behaviour change as we go forward. Another aspect for us is that we're really reliant on our younger generation in the City of Melbourne who are more likely to embrace change. They are early adopters traditionally of things, and it's really helped us with many of our initiatives, everything from banning plastic bags and plastic straws at Queen Victoria Market to a new program that we've started across the cafes of having recyclable cups and no paper cups. And the best adopters of those are young people who think it's absolutely brilliant and lead the way in terms of demand and change. And that then supplements the rest of the movement as we push these things out. So I do believe that that we're going to see change. I'm very encouraged by that, and I think that we have to keep balancing it with the more direct storytelling. It's something local government can do really well because we can point to the change. And whenever I go into a group and say we can lose 35% of our tree stock in the next 20 years if we don't start making a change, that's something that's very compelling. So we really point to what people are going to experience in their local neighbourhoods, and that really helps with change. Of course, one of our big challenges is that our daily population is about 3 times the size of our local population, and how we engage with the daily population is one of our biggest challenges in the city.
I would like to build on Sally's excellent comments here. I think if we want to expand people's spatial and temporal horizons about grasping this problem, the best thing is not to lecture them, but let them discover it themselves. And start with adaptation, because all the investment and effort in adaptation, the benefits are local. But you need to start by visualising what's going to happen to your place and what you're going to have to go without, like beaches, tolerable summers, a whole range of things. And once that's brought to scale, and it can be brought to scale now in quite a fine-grained way, people went, oh my God, we've got to start doing something. But it wouldn't be so bad if we also engaged in mitigation, not just for us, for everyone. So they join the dots themselves. It's not rocket science. So I think just providing with them information about what's going down in your district, in your neighbourhood. And although some people say, what's posterity ever done for me? Most people either have children or grandchildren or care about younger children, or else they're young and it's their future. And it's no surprise that those most concerned about climate change are youth, and next it's women, and last it's older white men. Present company in this room accepted. And so that's not rocket science either. So there's just a few short steps for that realisation that we're in this together. This complex interdependence mean we have to work on adaptation, climate and mitigation at the same time.
I just would like to respond to that. Look, this is, many people have said that we need to, it's ineffective to lecture people, that there is various, the 30% who can't be persuaded, it's the others that you have to get to. But we don't have time for that. We actually don't have time, and at the same time there are projects and programs that are happening at federal and state level that are locking us into high carbonisation projects, particularly in transport sector. So, what sort of level of change and governance change, empowering people to understand what's going on. They don't have the power. Collectively they do, but it's 4 years. how do you impact, how can you be impactful at that level when we are already locking in massive decisions now?
Voted out Tony Abbott and got in Zali Stagel, and she's now got a private member's bill, a strong climate bill in the federal parliament.
Like that, how could I not say something? I'm going to take it into a slightly different direction, and I think I'm still happy to have this recorded, but I believe that a critically important aspect, which is a flourishing industry in one sector, is the role of the legal sector in making climate change litigation actions against slow-moving or recalcitrant businesses, industries and governments. And I will be retiring from CSIRO, which has limited my engagement in 12 months' time, to become a weapon of use as an expert witness in the legal sector. And there are a number of cases that I'm already involved in advising from behind the scenes that I am aware of what's happening, including a number of legal groups that are involved in climate change litigation already.
Bravo,
I think we've forgotten that one of the major paths to success of Tony Abbott was that he was actually a very good marketeer. He was a great sloganer. You know, he could really conjure up things like the great big carbon tax. And for the very large number of people who still don't get climate change, and I mean, here anybody standing in this forum is talking to the converted, but we know that people can change. There can be behavioural change. We've seen things like solar panels being adopted widely because it gives you cheaper electricity, despite the fact you pay $3,000, $4,000, $10,000 to install in the first place. So you've got to get in this forum of people who believe in climate change, you've got to get some marketeers in there who actually sell the idea to the rest of the of our great country. Sorry, that wasn't a question, it was a statement.
I totally agree. And you were going to say something.
Well, only that in addition to what you're talking about, we have to change the media influence that is funded to support inaction.
Okay. Well, look, I'm going to take this opportunity to, if I say so. I will thank everyone again.
Roger, so you can use the mic.
And I've been wrestling over this well, thank you very much for that. We can ignore that for the time being. I've been wrestling over how to summarise this for some time. As you know, the forum was cancelled from August, so I've had an extra few months to redo this about 3 or 4 times. And I've been thinking about what sort of messages are most appropriate to put a rocket under this. So I'm not going to pull any punches, and I'm going to read you what I have to say, and it will take about 10 minutes because I've got a lot to say. The purpose of this forum is to look at the future we need to plan for. Traditionally, this is presented in economic terms without any reference to the rapidly changing world around us. Today, we have looked at the evidence of global change and the science to understand it, but it's worth reflecting on the implication in human terms if we continue to pursue business as usual. We're looking at environmental collapse and ultimately extinction. And it's worth pausing to reflect on what this really means. According to the science, by the turn of the century, the planet is 3 to 7 degrees hotter than pre-industrial times, and most of the biosphere has collapsed. And the vast majority of species, including humanity, are now extinct. But the planet will continue warming for another 2 or 3 centuries. There is some evidence of human evidence on the landscape, such as crumbling ruins of freeways, towers, buildings, and other monumental follies, some invaded by the sea, but no visible sign of life. There's an eerie quietness. No birds, no one to sing ode to joy. Any semblance of the arts and other wonders of human creation disappeared long ago with the onset of grinding depression, famine, conflict, and suffering as nations and people fought over declining food, water, and other essentials to survive. It had become a state of anarchy. Any concept of civil society disappeared long ago, and diseases of all kinds had become rife, reminiscent of the Great Plague centuries earlier, but far worse, with no relief in sight, because the natural environment which had supported human existence had been trashed. And the evidence remained. Oceans still awash with plastic and polluted by nuclear and other poisons that would take centuries to break down. We, the elders of the privileged few of our generation, might have scraped through and had a reasonable existence. We enjoyed the party while it lasted, but it was tough to survive in the end. For our children, that was a different story. And for our grandchildren, well, that turned out to be a disaster. And I would never have great-grandchildren. It's a nightmare scenario. I'm sure all of you would love me to be proved wrong, but I'm simply joining the dots based on the science presented today. And that is the future we must plan for if we continue to pursue business as usual. Our panel has identified the key problems and discussed some ways in which these can be addressed. If we really are committed to averting this calamity, the starting point must be to understand what the problem is and what is causing it. As you've heard today, there is no single cause. Quoting from Rachel Carlson's famous book Silent Spring, written nearly 60 years ago, what we have come to face is not an occasional dose of poison which has accidentally got into some article of food, but a persistent and continuous poisoning of the whole human environment on the land, the oceans and waterways, and the atmosphere, and we must include greenhouse gases in this category. With dedications to E.B. White, who said, "I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach is to beat it into submission. We would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively instead of sceptically and dictatorially." And to Albert Schweitzer, who said, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and forestall. He will end up destroying the earth." And that was nearly 60 years ago. There were earlier warnings, but they have grown louder since, and despite these warnings, we are on the same trajectory and the world's population has more than doubled since. The problem seems clear enough. Humanity has become a plague, too many people each consuming too much of the Earth's natural resources and polluting and trashing it in the process. And I'll repeat that more simply. Too much consumption for a growing population, too much pollution and environmental degradation. So the answer to our problem must be to reduce each of these, and that means fewer people eventually, less per capita consumption, environmental restoration and less pollution. Greenhouse emission reduction is critical, but we need to do much more and we're running out of time. Now, a lot of these things have been referred to in our forum, and that's terrific. But what is our government doing? Almost exactly the opposite. Australia is wedded to population and economic growth. In fact, Australia has been using population growth to drive economic growth for decades and doing very little to reduce pollution and environmental degradation. Its response to COVID shows how desperate it is to maintain business as usual, and our government is not alone. Humans remain addicted to the comforts and living standards business as usual provides. There's a lot of talk about sustainability, and there are some positive signs, but much of it is merely rebadging business as usual practices and behaviour shrouded in greenwash to make it look green or sustainable. That has to change. If humanity does not respond appropriately, the planet will do it for us by becoming an increasingly hostile place to live with reduced capacity to support life. We are seeing that now, but it will get worse as the years go by, and it will not happen gradually. There will be tipping points, as Will explained, where sudden changes occur, often unexpected like this pandemic. So the question is, have human societies the will and capacity to change to avert an impending calamity? And the magnitude of the challenge is huge. It's not just about climate, it's everything we do. And responding to that is our ultimate challenge. As Will's noted in his presentation in 2009, it will require a complete change in our values, aspirations and choices we make now and in the future. And Graham Turner also noted in his Limits to Growth presentation in 2009, technology and marginal change will not be enough. The evidence indicates that reliance on technology alone is likely to make matters worse. COVID has forced politicians, most of them, but with some notable exceptions, and decision makers to listen to the science. It is time to extend this thinking to the global environmental issues we've discussed today. Shock and threat of death is a great motivator for change. If people are scared of COVID, they should be absolutely scared of the impending environmental calamity we're facing, and this may force them to change and demand effective action, because if people understand the threat and need to act is now, then they're more likely to respond. But it'll also require a totally new way of thinking about us, humanity, and how precious life is in the first place. What a rare gift to be living on such an extraordinary planet where life took billions of years to establish, then blossom in a universe that is a mixture of frigid nothingness and unimaginable violence, yet within a century will destroy it. I think we need to accept the fact that our species is an integral part of the biosphere, that we are dependent, one way or another, on all other species on this planet for our survival. That if we continue to destroy our species, other species, as we're doing now on a massive scale, we are destroying our own future. And to put this into context, we're in the middle of the 6th greatest mass extinction event this planet has witnessed, all the result of human activity. I believe our capacity to embrace this thinking may ultimately determine whether we survive or become extinct like many other species that have failed to adapt to the changing world around them. And I really think language matters, and it's a bit like what you were saying, Mike, about how to sell it. I think it's time, I'm saying this on my own, that we abandon the word sustainable, a term no one really understands and is often misused as a goal, and use in its place the word survival, because that is what it has come to. There's a huge amount that needs to be done straight away, and an army, not just our armed forces, but the unemployed and many others that can be employed to tackle some of the most critical tasks that need to be done. Reduction of greenhouse gases emissions is a given, but we also need to reduce our consumption and the demands we make on the planet's natural resources. We need a giant land care project to restore much of the environment we have trashed, not just in Australia but throughout the world. We need a huge waste reduction, reuse and effective recycling program to reduce the poisoning impact on our planet and the demand we make on it harvesting the resources we need. We need to value these jobs properly and financially. We can't leave the heavy lifting, as so often happens, to volunteers and community groups and service organisation like Rotary with their Rotary for Bees project, which you know about, and it's my club that's running that project. No, we need to have it institutionalised so that it becomes part of everyone's life and the way they think. Sooner or later, and this is a really thorny one, we will be forced to depopulate, remembering that if we don't, the planet will do it for us. And there's much more, but don't pretend that technology and greenhouse gas reduction on their own will solve our problems. They won't. All of this has huge social and political implications and will put our institutions under enormous stress. It's a challenge, and it's a challenge to our democratic processes, and we've got to make it work one way or another. And finally, I must say a couple of things about transport. Since TFM is Transport for Melbourne, clearly we must work out ways to travel less often and more efficiently. That means more people walking and cycling. I nearly brought my bike here. I was let down badly by public transport, but I normally ride my bike anyway. But we also need to make better use of our buses, the forgotten mode of public transport that ties the public transport system together and is the only form of public transport available for most of Melbourne. But they also need to run more efficiently. And we need to stop building mega infrastructure projects state and federal governments have become absolutely obsessed with. Projects that are often built for the wrong reasons, deliver poor or questionable benefits, and designed for a future based on business as usual, a future that will not exist. And that would be a good start, but there's much more to do, and we need to start doing these things now. Now this leads to the question, where to from here? I hope everyone has the information now to pass on to others, policy and decision makers, including our politicians, with a message that this really is a matter of survival, and we are fast running out of time. We need our leaders to stand up and lead, to create an environment which enables people to place less demands on the planet's natural resources by consuming less, to stop polluting and trashing our planet. They're the ones that create the environment, and a lot of people just cannot do anything else but comply with it. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to act as their lives depend on it. Business as usual is a plan for extinction. We need a plan for survival now. Now, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in this forum, to you, the audience, and particularly the people I can't see, who are in virtual ether there somewhere, to my colleagues who have helped me put on the show, to the VLGA and Libby Clark in particular, for supporting us again by promoting this forum, taking the bookings, to our cameraman Keith Rhodes for videoing the proceedings today, and his assistant who is over there, to Adam Bandt and Sally Capp, thank you very, very much. You've made a significant contribution as panel members, and we are very, very appreciative of you being here. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers who've made a huge commitment to present here today, including Will Steffen, who made a special trip down from Canberra to be here today. It's not the first time. Will presented at my earlier forum in 2009, and it's been great to have you back again. Thank you, Will. Thank you all.
Thank you. So exciting to see you. Great to hear what
Sally, that's your free pass to get out the gate.
Thank you so much. That's very thoughtful of you. Thanks for having me, and look forward to